Picture this: a dimly lit chamber, the air thick with the scent of burning candle wax and fear. A man kneels before a tribunal of shadowed figures, their faces obscured by hoods. The charge: heresy. The penalty: if he refuses to confess, it's torture or worse. This wasn't just a scene of religious fervor. It was a calculated performance, one that played out thousands of times across Spain during the infamous Spanish Inquisition. But what if I told you that behind the chilling spectacle of these trials, there was something far more sinister at work, something hidden beneath the surface, masked by the guise of faith, political power, vast fortunes, and secrets that reshaped an empire? For centuries, the Spanish Inquisition has been remembered as a brutal campaign of religious purity, a dark chapter where the Church hunted heretics with ruthless efficiency. But what if that story is incomplete? What if the trials, the terror, the flames of the auto da fe were about more than just saving souls? Behind the screams and the smoke, there were whispers of something else: kings consolidating power, rivals disappearing overnight, and gold flowing into the right hands. The Inquisition wasn't just a tool of faith, it was a weapon wielded with precision by those who stood to gain the most. This is the untold story of the Spanish Inquisition, the hidden agendas that turned piety into profit and fear into control. Over the next few minutes, we'll pull back the curtain on this centuries-old mystery, revealing how the Inquisition became one of history's most ruthless political machines. You'll see how its victims were carefully chosen, how its trials were meticulously staged, and how its legacy was crafted to serve the powerful. By the time we're done, you'll never look at this dark period the same way again. So settle in, because what you're about to discover goes far beyond what the history books have told you. The truth is darker, more calculated, and far more fascinating than you ever imagined. At the heart of the Spanish Inquisition lies a story not of pure religious zeal, but of cold, calculated ambition. When Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile married in 1469, they didn't just unite two crowns, they set their sights on forging a single, unshakable kingdom. But Spain was a fractured land, divided by old rivalries, competing nobles, and a population that included Jews, Muslims, and converts whose loyalty was suspect. The monarchs needed a tool to silence dissent, centralize authority, and fund their growing ambitions. Enter the Inquisition, approved by Pope Sixtus IV in 1478 under the noble pretense of purifying the faith. On the surface, the Inquisition's mission was straightforward: hunt down false converts, Jews and Muslims who had supposedly embraced Christianity but still practiced their old faith in secret. But the real targets weren't just spiritual. Wealthy Jewish communities, especially those who had converted to avoid persecution, controlled vast networks of trade and finance. By accusing them of heresy, the crown could confiscate their property, filling royal coffers while eliminating potential rivals. The first Grand Inquisitor, Tomás de Torquemada, wasn't just a fanatic monk. He was a political operative handpicked by Ferdinand and Isabella to ensure the Inquisition served their interests. And serve them it did. Trials were rarely about doctrine, they were spectacles of fear. Witnesses could accuse neighbors anonymously, verdicts were preordained, and confessions were extracted through torture. But the goal wasn't just to punish, it was to send a message. Nobles who resisted royal authority suddenly found themselves under scrutiny. Regions hesitant to bow to Castile's dominance were reminded of the consequences. With every auto da fe, every public burning, Ferdinand and Isabella tightened their grip, using terror to sculpt a unified, obedient Spain. The Inquisition wasn't just a religious purge, it was the birth of a modern police state where faith became the mask for raw power. But if the Inquisition was truly about faith, why did so many of its victims come from one particular group, the Conversos? These were Jewish families who had converted to Christianity, often under pressure, yet still found themselves in the crosshairs of the tribunal. The accusation was always the same: crypto-Judaism, the secret practice of Jewish rituals behind closed doors. But scratch beneath the surface and a different motive emerges. The Conversos weren't just spiritual suspects, they were economic powerhouses controlling trade networks, lending money to nobles, and amassing fortunes that made them indispensable and enviable. Take the case of Luis de la Cavalleria, a wealthy Converso financier in 15th century Zaragoza. His family had served the crown for generations, funding royal projects and even brokering political alliances. But when Ferdinand and Isabella needed money for their war against Granada, suddenly Louis found himself accused of lighting Sabbath candles in secret. His trial was swift, his property confiscated, and his influence erased overnight. This wasn't an isolated incident, it was a pattern. Across Spain, the Inquisition's notaries meticulously documented homes, businesses, and landholdings before trials even began, as if the verdict were a foregone conclusion. The real crime wasn't heresy, it was wealth, and the tribunals made sure the public understood the stakes. Auto da fe executions weren't just punishments, they were financial spectacles. Before victims were led to the stake, officials would parade lists of their seized assets through the streets: silks, spices, gold. The message was clear: defiance had a price and the crown would collect. Even confession didn't guarantee safety. Many Conversos, terrified into admitting false charges, still saw their livelihoods dismantled. A penitent might escape execution, but their children could be barred from universities, their relatives forbidden from holding office. The Inquisition didn't just take property, it broke dynasties. What made this system so devastating was its veneer of legality. Unlike open theft, confiscations were dressed in holy righteousness. The Church declared heresy a crime against God, and the state enforced it as treason. But the archives tell another story. In Valencia, records show inquisitors splitting seized estates with local nobles. In Toledo, merchants suddenly found their rival shops shuttered after anonymous accusations. This wasn't justice, it was a racket, one where faith became the perfect cover for greed. The Converso problem wasn't about religion, it was about who controlled the money and ultimately the future of Spain itself. Yet the cruelest irony. Many Conversos were devout Christians, some for generations. Their ancestors had converted willingly, often to fully participate in Spanish society. But blood purity laws, the infamous limpieza de sangre, ensured they could never truly belong. Even after centuries, a single whispered accusation could unravel a family's entire standing. The Inquisition didn't just exploit fear. It manufactured an enemy that didn't exist, then profitably hunted it for centuries. And in doing so, it didn't just steal wealth, it drained Spain of the very people who had helped build its economy, leaving wounds that would take generations to heal. The concept of pure blood might sound medieval, but its consequences were chillingly modern. The limpieza de sangre statutes didn't just discriminate. They rewrote the rules of Spanish society, creating an invisible hierarchy where ancestry mattered more than faith or merit. On paper, these laws claimed to protect the Church from contamination by those with Jewish or Muslim heritage. In reality, they became a weapon of social control, dividing families, locking doors to opportunity, and ensuring power stayed in the hands of a privileged few, the so-called old Christians. Take the university system, where bright young scholars could once rise through talent alone. By the mid-1600s, students had to present genealogical records stretching back generations, proving not a drop of impure blood flowed in their veins. A single ancestor's conversion, even centuries earlier, could derail an entire lineage's future. The irony, many of these old Christian families had skeletons in their own closets. In Seville, records show nobles paying bribes to falsify family trees, while in Valladolid, entire branches were quietly pruned from public records. Purity wasn't about truth, it was about perception. The laws also reshaped everyday life in subtle, insidious ways. Guilds excluded converso craftsmen, parishes barred tainted families from prestigious religious brotherhoods, and marriages became transactions of pedigree rather than love. Even charity-turned predatory hospitals demanded blood purity proofs before treating the sick, while dowries for impoverished, old Christian girls were subsidized by fines levied on converso communities. The message was clear: your worth wasn't measured by deeds but by lineage. What made this system so effective was its bureaucratic cruelty. Unlike the violent spectacle of auto da fe, blood purity worked through paperwork. A network of notaries, priests, and informants stood ready to challenge anyone's status. In Granada, a woman named Isabel was denied her late husband's estate because a neighbor testified her great-grandmother once refused pork. In Toledo, a merchant's application to trade with the Americas was rejected after someone unearthed a 200-year-old baptismal record showing a Jewish name. The past wasn't just present, it was a loaded weapon, always pointed at the vulnerable. Yet the greatest damage wasn't legal or economic, it was psychological. Families splintered as relatives disowned impure branches to protect their own status. Some conversos fled to the colonies, only to find the Inquisition's reach extended across the Atlantic. Others paid exorbitant fees for fabricated genealogies, living in constant fear of exposure. The laws didn't just police blood, they poisoned trust, turning neighbor against neighbor in a silent war of suspicion. By the 18th century, Spain's obsession with purity had crippled the very society it claimed to protect. Physicians, scholars, and skilled artisans from converso backgrounds fled to places like Amsterdam or Istanbul, taking knowledge and innovation with them. Meanwhile, the old Christian elite grew stagnant, clinging to titles while falling behind Europe's scientific and economic revolutions. The blood purity laws didn't preserve Spain, they strangled it, proving that when you privilege ancestry over ability, everyone loses. And the bitterest lesson, the very people who enforced these statutes often carried the tainted blood they feared. Genetic studies now reveal that modern Spaniards, including descendants of inquisitors, share significant ancestry with those persecuted communities. The purity they hunted was a myth all along. What made the Spanish Inquisition terrifying wasn't just the torture chambers or the public burnings, it was the paperwork. Behind every arrest, every confiscation, every execution lay an obsessive bureaucracy, a system so meticulous it wouldn't seem out of place in a modern surveillance state. Each tribunal employed armies of scribes, notaries, and record keepers, transforming fear into a science. Witness testimonies were copied in triplicate, property inventories filled ledgers, and family lineages were traced through generations with chilling precision. This wasn't medieval chaos, it was institutional power refined to a razor's edge. Consider the case files of Maria Gonzalez, a lacemaker from Cordoba accused in 1603 of whispering Jewish prayers. The tribunal's dossier on her stretched for pages, neighbors' statements cross-referenced with prior accusations, notes on her market purchases, even an analysis of how often she lit candles on Fridays. What's striking isn't the cruelty, it's the cold efficiency. Like a corporation auditing expenses, the Inquisition quantified heresy, turning suspicion into data. And that data had a purpose. When Maria's shop was seized, every bolt of fabric, every copper coin was logged, not just for punishment but for profit. The archives reveal a pattern: the more detailed the records, the wealthier the target. The system's true innovation, though, was its legal theater. Defendants received formal charges, could name favorable witnesses, and even appeal to the Supreme Council in Madrid. On the surface, it looked fair, but the rules were rigged. Accusers remained anonymous, while the accused had to guess their enemies. Evidence standards were laughable. A rumor from a disgruntled servant carried the same weight as a priest's testimony. And the ultimate trick, confession didn't end the process. Even if you admitted to heresy, the tribunal kept investigating, extracting names of accomplices, digging deeper into your network. It was a self-perpetuating machine, feeding on fresh suspects to justify its existence. Nowhere was this clearer than in the Inquisition's use of genealogy. Long before modern background checks, they perfected the art of tracking bloodlines. Family trees were reconstructed from parish records, baptismal certificates scrutinized for hints of Jewish or Muslim names. In Cuenca, a man named Diego was convicted because his great-grandmother's baptismal record listed her as Isabel, daughter of Abraham, a detail buried for 80 years. These weren't spontaneous hunts, they were audits with the past weaponized against the present, and the records didn't vanish. Once tainted, a family's file remained active, ready to be dusted off when new accusations arose or new wealth needed seizing. The most haunting part, the system outlived its creators. Long after Torquemada's death, the bureaucracy kept running, fueled by inertia and institutional self-interest. Tribunal officials were paid from confiscated property, creating a perverse incentive to keep finding heresy. In Valencia, records show inquisitors complaining of slow seasons when accusations dipped until conveniently a wealthy merchant would be denounced. By the 18th century, the Inquisition had become less about faith and more about sustaining itself, a sprawling apparatus that survived not because Spain needed it, but because too many hands were feeding from its trough. Yet in its obsession with control, the Inquisition left behind an unintended gift, its own confession. Those mountains of parchment meant to consolidate power now expose its mechanisms. Today, historians trace corruption through marginal notes where inquisitors haggled over bribe amounts, or folios where entire cases were quietly dropped after a well-placed donation to the church. The archives don't just record victims, they indict the system, and that's the final irony. The very bureaucracy built to erase dissent ended up preserving its truth for posterity, a testament to how even the most polished machines of oppression can't silence paper. Or history. The torture chambers of the Spanish Inquisition weren't just about extracting confessions, they were carefully designed theaters of terror, where every scream served a political purpose. Take the infamous strappado, a deceptively simple device. Victims' hands were bound behind their backs, then hoisted into the air by a rope, dislocating their shoulders in slow, agonizing increments. But here's the twist. Inquisitors often dropped prisoners mid-sentence, not to end the pain, but to amplify it. The sudden jolt didn't just break bones, it shattered resolve, leaving detainees desperate to agree to anything. And that was the point. The goal wasn't truth, it was compliance, a spectacle so horrifying it would ripple through entire communities. Psychological manipulation was just as calculated. Before torture even began, prisoners were subjected to the método de la vela, the candle method. Strapped to a chair, they'd watch as a flame slowly burned toward their skin, while an inquisitor calmly listed every accusation. The delay itself was torture, each second stretching into an eternity of dread. Some were shown instruments stained with blood, often animal pigment, to convince them resistance was futile. Others endured mock executions, blindfolded and led to believe they'd be drowned or burned, only to be saved at the last moment, a twisted gesture meant to inspire gratitude toward their tormentors. The real genius of this system, its unpredictability. Torture wasn't applied uniformly, it was a carefully rationed threat. A merchant might suffer only psychological pressure, while his neighbor endured the rack, ensuring no one could predict who'd be broken next. This randomness cultivated paranoia, turning communities into networks of informants. In Seville, records show cases where siblings accused each other preemptively, hoping to spare themselves. The Inquisition didn't just want confessions, it wanted society to police itself. Even the architecture played a role. Prisons were built with soundproofed whisper rooms where prisoners could overhear but not see interrogations. The muffled screams created a horrifying audio collage, leaving imaginations to fill in the blanks. One account from Toledo describes a captive spending nights counting the footsteps outside his cell, knowing each one could mean another victim or his turn. This wasn't chaos, it was choreography designed to make terror feel omnipresent yet invisible. Yet the most insidious weapon wasn't physical, it was hope. Inquisitors dangled the possibility of mercy, offering lighter sentences for full confessions, but full meant implicating others, weaving webs of guilt that ensnared entire families. A single accusation could trigger chain reactions, like the case in Valencia where a baker's confession led to 74 arrests within weeks. The message was clear: no one was safe because trust itself had become dangerous. By the time the auto da fe arrived, the real work was already done. The public burnings weren't just punishments, they were final acts in a psychological opera, reinforcing what the torture chambers had whispered for months: resistance was useless and the crown's reach was infinite. What lingered afterward wasn't just the smell of smoke, but the silence of a population learning to swallow their doubts. The Inquisition didn't just break bodies, it rewired minds, turning fear into a currency more valuable than gold. And for those in power, that was the ultimate prize. The auto da fe wasn't just an execution, it was a masterclass in psychological control. A gruesome pageant where every detail, from the costumes to the choreography, reinforced who held power in Spain. Picture the scene: a city square packed with thousands, the air thick with incense and anticipation. On a raised platform, prisoners in yellow San Benito sackcloth robes painted with flames and devils sat frozen as priests recited their sins. But this wasn't spontaneous violence, it was scripted down to the minute. The order of processions, the timing of speeches, even the placement of nobles in the crowd were calculated to maximize impact. These events didn't just punish heretics, they staged an empire's dominance in living color. Take the auto da fe of 1624 in Madrid, where King Philip IV himself presided. The scaffolding was draped in black velvet, embroidered with silver crosses, a visual reminder that church and crown stood united. When the first condemned man stumbled forward, officials made sure the crowd caught every detail: his shaved head, the gag silencing his final words, the way his chains clanked as he was led to the stake. But the real message came between the lines. By holding the event on a holy day, the Inquisition tied divine approval to its brutality, framing terror as sacred duty. And when royal heralds announced confiscated properties would fund a new cathedral, the subtext was clear: rebellion didn't just risk your soul, it funded your oppressor's glory. The genius of these spectacles lay in their audience participation. Townspeople weren't just observers, they were cast as extras in a morality play. Children were given front-row seats to learn piety, while confraternities competed for the honor of escorting prisoners. In Seville, bakers distributed heretics' bread, burnt loaves symbolizing purification, turning a communal meal into complicity. Even the timing played tricks. Auto da fe often began at dawn, stretching past nightfall so torches would illuminate the final burnings, engraving the images in memory. This wasn't justice, it was collective conditioning, using horror to sow obedience into the fabric of daily life. Yet the most chilling effect was how it reshaped language. Witness accounts describe crowds not with revulsion but with terms like festive or edifying. Pamphlets circulated afterward poeticized screams as the songs of angels guiding lost souls. The propaganda was so effective that victims sometimes internalized it. In Logroño, a dying man thanked inquisitors for saving him, while in Cordoba, families of the condemned were seen kneeling in gratitude. The spectacle didn't just enforce power, it rewrote reality, convincing people to applaud their own chains. What made the auto da fe enduring wasn't its cruelty, but its adaptability. When Enlightenment critics began condemning public burnings, the Inquisition pivoted. By the 1700s, executions were rarer, but the theater remained, now featuring penitents in dunce caps parading through streets, their humiliation serving the same purpose as flames. The props changed, but the plot didn't. Authority must be seen to be believed, and in that, the auto-da-fe was eerily modern. Its legacy lives on in every regime that stages show trials, every leader who confuses spectacle for strength. Because when fear becomes entertainment, the crowd forgets to ask who's really pulling the ropes. The Moriscos, Spanish Muslims forcibly converted to Christianity, learned a brutal lesson: faith alone couldn't protect them. Like the Conversos, they faced relentless scrutiny, but their persecution had a distinctive twist. While Jewish converts were hunted for their wealth, the Moriscos were targeted for something even more valuable: their land. After the fall of Granada in 1492, Spain's last Muslim kingdom, the crown demanded mass baptisms. Overnight, entire communities became Christian, at least on paper. But their farms, irrigation systems, and artisanal skills made them indispensable and enviable. The Inquisition's solution: invent heresy where none existed, then seize the spoils. In Valencia, where Morisco laborers cultivated the lush huertas that fed Spain's cities, trials followed harvest cycles. Accusations of secret Ramadan fasts or washing before prayer would surface just as crops ripened. Records show inquisitors auctioning confiscated orchards within weeks, often to local nobles who'd orchestrated the denunciations. One case from 1584 reveals a duke acquiring 600 acres of orange groves after the arrest of a Morisco farming collective. Their crime: a neighbor swore he'd heard them reciting the Shahada. No evidence was produced, but the land changed hands anyway. The Inquisition's tactics here were shamelessly transparent. Unlike Conversos, who were accused of Judaizing, Moriscos faced charges like Moorish customs, a catch-all term for anything from wearing traditional dress to cooking with saffron. In Cuenca, a woman named Fatima was convicted because her stew smelled too strongly of cumin, a spice deemed suspiciously North African. These absurd accusations masked a grim reality. Morisco communities controlled prime real estate, especially in Aragon and Andalusia, where their ancestors had engineered terraced farms and water channels that Spanish Christians struggled to replicate. Removing them wasn't about piety, it was about property. The final act came in 1609, when Philip III ordered the expulsion of all Moriscos from Spain. Nearly 300,000 people were marched to ports, their homes and workshops seized by the crown. But the economic fallout was immediate. Regions like Valencia collapsed into famine as inexperienced new owners let irrigation systems crumble. Silk production, a Morisco specialty, plummeted, and olive yields never recovered. The irony: many expelled Moriscos resettled in North Africa, where they rebuilt their lives while Spain's economy stagnated. The land grab had worked, but at what cost? What makes the Morisco persecution especially chilling is how it weaponized culture itself. Unlike the Conversos, who could theoretically prove their Christianity through doctrine, Moriscos were damned by everyday habits. Dancing to Zambra music, speaking Arabic at home, even the way they swaddled babies, all became evidence of heresy. Inquisitors compiled manuals listing Moorish behaviors like detectives cataloging crimes. This wasn't just racism, it was erasure, a campaign to purge Spain of an entire way of life. And when the land was empty, the crown discovered too late that it hadn't just exiled people, it had expelled prosperity itself. Yet the Moriscos left an indelible mark. Walk through Andalusia today and you'll see it: the almond trees they grafted, the tilework patterns that still adorn churches, the flamenco rhythms echoing their abandoned songs. Their story is more than a footnote to the Inquisition. It's a warning of how greed dresses itself in righteousness and how a nation can starve itself trying to swallow the past. The Moriscos weren't just victims, they were mirrors, reflecting the contradictions of an empire that coveted their labor but despised their identity. And in that reflection, we see the true cost of purity, not in blood, but in barren fields and silent looms, long after the last forced footsteps faded toward the sea. When Spanish galleons crossed the Atlantic, they carried more than just colonists and crucifixes. They brought the Inquisition's shadow. Established in Mexico City by 1571, the colonial tribunals mirrored Spain's playbook but with a sinister new twist. Here, heresy wasn't just a crime against God, it was rebellion against empire. The first auto da fe in the Americas, held in Lima in 1578, didn't target indigenous shamans or defiant conquistadors. Instead, the flames consumed an unlikely victim, a French tailor named Mateo Salado, accused of Lutheranism. His execution sent a deliberate message: the Inquisition would police not just souls, but loyalties in a land where distance from Madrid bred dissent. The tribunal's real power lay in their flexibility. In Peru, they crushed indigenous resistance by prosecuting idolatry, destroying sacred huacas under the guise of eradicating devil worship. Yet in Mexico, where silver mines bankrolled the empire, the Holy Office turned a blind eye to mestizo miners blending Catholic and native rituals so long as the silver kept flowing. This wasn't inconsistency, it was calculus. When a Pueblo healer in New Mexico was burned in 1680, her trial emphasized how her prophecies urged rejection of Spanish rule. Meanwhile, Portuguese merchants in Cartagena faced accusations of Judaizing. Whenever their trade networks rivaled crown monopolies, faith became the leash for a continent. But the Inquisition's most enduring colonial weapon was its paperwork. Ships arriving in Veracruz or Callao were met with familiars, not priests, but bureaucrats demanding passenger manifests and cargo lists. These agents compiled sprawling archives tracking lineage, commerce, and even gossip. A rumor about a Buenos Aires merchant's ancestor could bar him from office. A scribe's notation about a Potosi widow's suspicious charity might trigger asset forfeiture. Unlike the violence of conquest, this system worked quietly, weaving control into the fabric of daily life. By the 1700s, colonial elites internalized the rules, self-censoring, marrying pure spouses, donating to tribunals, not out of piety, but because the Inquisition had made fear a currency. The ultimate irony: Spain's grip weakened even as the tribunals thrived. When Napoleon invaded in 1808, colonial courts suddenly found themselves starved of funds and authority. Yet instead of collapsing, many reinvented themselves as nationalist tools. Mexican inquisitors pivoted to hunting pro-independence conspirators, while in Colombia, the tribunal persecuted French sympathizers. The institution meant to bind the colonies to Madrid ultimately proved how fragile that bond really was and how easily terror could be repurposed. By the time the last American auto da fe flickered out in 19th century Lima, the Inquisition had outlived its creators, leaving behind not just ashes, but the blueprint for how empire's police thought itself. The Index of Forbidden Books wasn't just a list, it was a lock on the Spanish mind. Published in 1559 under Pope Paul IV, the Index banned thousands of titles, from Protestant theology to Arabic astronomy. On the surface, it targeted heresy, but flip through its pages and a pattern emerges. The real danger wasn't just unorthodox ideas, it was any thinking that might unravel the social order. When the Inquisition burned a Barcelona bookseller's stock in 1612, the condemned volumes weren't just Bibles in Catalan. They included geometry treatises arguing the Earth wasn't the universe's center. The message was clear: challenge Aristotle and you challenge the crown. This wasn't medieval obscurantism, it was damage control. By the 17th century, Spain's grip on its empire depended on controlling not just bodies but thoughts. Dutch maps showing New World trade routes banned, they revealed colonial vulnerabilities. Essays on constitutional monarchy by French philosophers forbidden, they might inspire dissent in Madrid. Even Cervantes' Don Quixote faced censorship, not for blasphemy, but for satirizing the very ideals of chivalry that justified Spain's wars. The Index didn't just guard faith, it shielded a crumbling status quo from the tide of reason. The censorship machine worked through layers of complicity. University professors had to swear oaths rejecting listed books, while printers paid verification fees to have manuscripts pre-approved. In Seville, inspectors prowled dockside warehouses, seizing shipments with the zeal of customs agents, except their contraband wasn't drugs or weapons but dictionaries. One 1650 case from Salamanca reveals a student sentenced to public flogging for possessing a smuggled copy of Descartes. His crime, the book's opening line, "I think, therefore I am," undermined the Inquisition's core premise, that truth came only through church-sanctioned revelation. Yet the Index's greatest power lay in its omissions. Alongside famous bands like Erasmus or Galileo, it quietly blacklisted lesser-known Spanish reformers. The works of Juan de Valdez, who argued for translating scripture into vernacular languages, vanished from libraries. Louis Vives' humanitarian writings on poor relief were excised from curricula. These weren't radical texts, they were bridges to moderate Enlightenment thought, carefully dismantled to keep Spain intellectually isolated. The result: while French salons debated Newton, Spanish scholars passed century-old commentaries on Aquinas, their world shrinking with each expurgated page. The system's absurdity peaked with the case of Benito Feiju, an 18th-century monk who dared to write about European science. His essays were banned not because they were wrong, but because they proved how far Spain had fallen behind. The Inquisition's own censors confessed they couldn't understand his references to electricity or germ theory, so they defaulted to prohibition. When Feiju appealed to King Ferdinand VI, even the monarch couldn't overturn the verdict without undermining the church. The irony was tragic. Spain's guardians of knowledge had become its jailers, burning the very ideas that could have saved their empire from obsolescence. By the time the Index was finally abolished in 1966, its legacy was irreversible. Generations of Spaniards had been taught that curiosity was dangerous, innovation suspect. The cost wasn't just in banned books, it was in the breakthroughs never attempted, the debates never had, the future never imagined. The Inquisition's lists didn't just erase pages, they erased possibilities, leaving a nation to wander the corridors of history long after the Enlightenment had opened the doors. The Inquisition's ledgers tell a damning story, one where piety and profit shared the same ledger line. Every confession extracted, every body burned, translated into cold, hard currency for the crown. Take the case of Diego de Suzan, a wealthy converso banker in 15th century Seville. When he was accused of secretly observing Jewish holidays, the tribunal didn't just demand his repentance, they itemized his estate down to the last silver spoon. His mansion became a tribunal headquarters, his vineyards funded the next auto-da-fe, and his daughter's dowry, a small fortune in pearls, mysteriously vanished into the pockets of the inquisitor who tried her. This wasn't justice, it was a forced liquidation with the church as the primary creditor. The scale of these confiscations was staggering. Records from Toledo show that between 1520 and 1550 alone, the Inquisition seized over 2 million maravedis, enough to bankroll entire military campaigns. King Philip II famously used confiscated converso assets to fund his wars against Protestant rebels in the Netherlands, while the gilded altarpieces of Valladolid's churches were literally built with the melted-down jewelry of accused heretics. But the real windfall came from the system's built-in incentives. Inquisitors received a cut of every forfeiture, usually 20%, turning heresy trials into a commission-driven enterprise. In Cuenca, one prosecutor's personal accounts reveal he amassed a small palace from the fines he levied on local merchants. Some seizures were so brazen they bordered on parody. In 1605, a Valencia silk trader named Louis Vives was accused of Judaizing after refusing to sell his inventory to the local bishop's nephew at a discount. His looms were donated to a monastery run by the same bishop, while the nephew's shop suddenly boasted Vives' signature damask patterns. Even the dead weren't safe. When the corpse of a wealthy landowner in Granada was posthumously convicted in 1632, his heirs were billed for back taxes on property the crown had already seized. The system's corruption became self-sustaining. As royal debts mounted in the 17th century, tribunals were quietly instructed to prioritize wealthy targets. A memo from Madrid in 1687 urged inquisitors to show particular vigilance toward tax collectors and mint officials, coincidentally, positions often held by conversos. In Zaragoza, 2 entire neighborhoods were effectively depopulated after the crown discovered their residents held shares in competing trade routes to the Americas. The properties were redistributed to loyal nobles, while the original owners, given a choice between penniless exile or the rack. Yet the greatest irony lay in the paperwork. Every confiscation required meticulous documentation, and those very records now expose the scheme. Marginal notes in Seville's archives show inquisitors haggling over bribe amounts, while ledgers from Barcelona list auction prices next to the names of tribunal members who mysteriously acquired the goods. In one particularly blatant case, a judge in Salamanca sentenced a rival's entire family to imprisonment, then legally adopted their orphaned son, sole heir to a lucrative mercury mine. The boy conveniently disappeared within a year, leaving the mine in the judge's hands. This wasn't just greed, it was institutionalized theft, sanctified by scripture and enforced by terror. When the Spanish economy collapsed in the late 17th century, the crown didn't reform the system, it doubled down, ordering tribunals to re-examine old cases for overlooked assets. The result, a macabre recycling of suffering. Grandchildren paying for grandparents' alleged sins, widows evicted from homes their families had reclaimed decades earlier. The Inquisition didn't just burn heretics, it melted entire lives into currency, leaving behind not just ashes but account books dripping with blood and ink. Beneath the cloak of religious fervor, the Spanish Inquisition waged another, quieter war, one not against heretics but against rival power structures. Local magistrates, town councils, and even bishops often found themselves locked in bitter turf battles with inquisitors, revealing an uncomfortable truth: the tribunals cared as much about dominance as doctrine. In Murcia, 1589, a shouting match erupted when the city's corregidor, a royal governor, arrested a suspected blasphemer, only to have inquisitors storm the jail, insisting their authority superseded the crown's. The real issue: the accused was a tax collector sitting on records that implicated tribunal officials in embezzlement. His heresy trial lasted just long enough for those documents to vanish. These clashes weren't anomalies, they were baked into the system. Papal bulls granted the Inquisition extraordinary privileges, immunity from local laws, the right to bypass secular courts, even control over prisons. But in practice, these privileges collided with medieval Spain's patchwork of fueros, regional legal codes that nobles and cities guarded fiercely. Take the case of Zaragoza in 1517, where the local parliament refused to hand over a knight accused of sheltering Jews. The standoff turned violent when inquisitors sent armed familiars to seize him, only to be met by the city's own militia. For weeks, Aragonese nobles threatened to revolt unless the crown reigned in the tribunal. The eventual compromise: the knight was tried, but by a special panel including local judges, a stinging rebuke to inquisitorial overreach. Ecclesiastical power struggles were even messier. In Toledo, Archbishop Silisio famously excommunicated an entire inquisitorial team in 1550 for prosecuting his protégés without permission. The tribunal retaliated by accusing him of protecting Judaizers until Rome intervened, forcing both sides into an uneasy truce. Such infighting exposed the Inquisition's open secret. It answered less to the Pope than to the Spanish crown, which used it as a cudgel against competing power centers. When Portuguese merchants in Seville grew too influential in the Indies trade, suddenly their warehouses were raided for forbidden texts. When Catalan guilds resisted royal tariffs, leaders found themselves investigated for Lutheran sympathies. The heresy charge became political Swiss Army knife, adaptable to any threat. Nowhere was this clearer than in the Basque Country, where the Inquisition's attempts to establish tribunals failed spectacularly. Local assemblies argued their ancient fueros exempted them from outside ecclesiastical courts, and backed it up by refusing to fund inquisitorial staff or buildings. By 1600, the region was the closest thing Spain had to an Inquisition-free zone, proving that where local authority held firm, even the Holy Office could be checked. The ultimate irony, these conflicts left paper trails far more damning than any confession. Correspondence between Madrid and regional tribunals shows crown officials fretting over overzealous inquisitors angering useful nobles. In Valencia, a bishop's diary complains of tribunal agents fishing for offences where none exist, to justify seizing a rival's wine harvest. Even the Supreme Council in Madrid occasionally reprimanded subordinates for exceeding mandate, code for stepping on the wrong toes. These weren't doctrinal disputes, they were bureaucratic knife fights fought with subpoenas instead of swords. What emerges isn't the monolithic terror of legend, but a fractious, self-interested institution constantly bumping against the limits of its power. The Inquisition's greatest heresy might have been its own hypocrisy, preaching unity while sowing discord, claiming divine authority while chasing earthly influence. And in those cracks between the rhetoric and the reality, we see the truth: no empire, no matter how pious, is immune to the oldest sin of all, the hunger for control. Women accused of witchcraft during the Spanish Inquisition didn't just face persecution, they were casualties in a silent war against female autonomy. Midwives, herbalists, and healers made particularly tempting targets, not because they practiced dark magic, but because they held something dangerous: knowledge. These women understood childbirth, medicine, and the workings of the female body, realms where the Church had little authority. Take the case of Maria Solis, a midwife in 16th century Galicia. When a nobleman's wife died in childbirth under her care, Solis wasn't blamed for medical error, she was charged with summoning demons to strangle the baby. Her real crime, owning a handwritten book of herbal remedies passed down through generations that local monks couldn't decipher. The tribunal burned it as a grimoire, then sent her to the stake for good measure. The pattern was deliberate. By framing traditional feminine roles as gateways to heresy, the Inquisition reshaped entire communities. In Catalonia, records show village after village losing their curanderas healers who treated everything from fevers to broken bones with poultices and prayers. Once these women disappeared, reliance shifted to male physicians, who were not only costlier but required approval from church authorities. The effect was twofold. It funneled money and control into institutional hands while severing networks of female knowledge that had operated outside official channels. Even seemingly benign practices became suspect. A Seville widow named Elvira was arrested for sorcery after neighbors reported her humming folk songs while spinning wool songs the inquisitors decided were coded invocations to the devil. Her spinning wheel, they claimed, was a satanic tool for ensnaring souls. What made these accusations so effective was their flexibility. Unlike charges against Conversos or Moriscos, which required genealogical scrutiny, witchcraft allegations could hinge on anything: a birthmark, a reputation for healing, even an argument with a priest's housekeeper. In Valencia, a teenage girl was denounced after rejecting a magistrate's advances. Her accuser swore her refusal proved she'd made a pact with the devil to remain unnaturally chaste. The trial records reveal no evidence beyond his bruised ego, yet she spent 2 years in prison before confessing under torture. The underlying message was clear: female independence, whether intellectual, economic, or sexual, was itself a form of heresy. Nowhere was this more evident than in the persecution of the beaters, laywomen who lived in pious communities without formal vows. These groups often operated like early feminist collectives, supporting themselves through weaving or teaching, and their autonomy unsettled both church and state. When the Beata Isabel de Jesus gained fame in Madrid for her visions, the Inquisition didn't just challenge her theology, they dissected her lifestyle. Her refusal to marry, her leadership of other women, even her habit of writing letters to nobles were all framed as evidence of diabolical pride. The real threat wasn't mysticism, it was a woman commanding influence without male intermediaries. The darkest irony, many witchcraft accusations originated from other women neighbors envious of a midwife's status, rivals for a lover's attention, even mothers-in-law seeking control of a widow's property. The Inquisition didn't invent misogyny, it weaponized existing fractures, turning communal mistrust into a self-policing nightmare. In Extremadura, a ledger from 1592 records 8 women denouncing a local healer only for 6 to later face charges themselves in a domino effect of paranoia. By the 17th century, entire regions saw generations of herbal knowledge vanish as mothers stopped teaching daughters, fearing even whispered recipes might invite the knock at midnight. Yet traces of resistance linger. In Andalusia today, elder women still guard fragments of old remedies not as spells but as quiet acts of defiance. Their ancestors may have been forced to kneel before tribunals, but the knowledge survived, whispered like a secret between the lines of history. The Inquisition sought to erase these women, but their real legacy isn't in the trial records, it's in the stubborn persistence of what they refused to let burn. While witch trials swept through Europe like wildfire, Spain's flames burned differently. In regions like Germany and Scotland, thousands perished under accusations of consorting with the devil, whole villages decimated by paranoia. But in Spain, the Inquisition took a surprising stance: skepticism. Far from embracing the witch-hunting frenzy, tribunal officials often dismissed claims of black magic as peasant superstition or even outright lies. The difference wasn't tolerance, it was strategy. Witch trials threatened to derail the Inquisition's true priorities, consolidating political power and seizing wealth. Chasing after toothless old women didn't fill royal coffers like prosecuting wealthy Conversos or Moriscos. A memo from the Suprema, the Inquisition's governing body, spells it out plainly. In 1526, northern inquisitors wrote to Madrid requesting permission to investigate a cluster of rumored witches in Navarre. The response was chilling in its pragmatism. Do not waste time on these matters, which are often fantasies of the ignorant, when Judaizers and heretics of substance demand your attention. Translation: witches were poor, unlikely to yield profitable confiscations, and worse, their trials risked turning into chaotic spectacles that might undermine the Inquisition's carefully crafted image of sober, legalistic authority. When accusations did surface, the tribunals applied a level of scrutiny unheard of elsewhere in Europe. In one notorious 1580 case from Logroño, a group of women confessed under torture to flying on goats to demonic Sabbaths. Instead of rushing to burn them, the Inquisitor Alonso de Salazar Frias demanded physical proof: the goats, the ointments, the devil's contract. Finding none, he secured their release and later wrote, "These matters must be proven with greater certainty than any others, for they so exceed natural order." Compare this to the Salem trials, where spectral evidence, visions only the accusers could see, sent 19 to the gallows. The contrast wasn't just procedural, it was cultural. While German witch hunters scoured villages for witches' marks, Spanish inquisitors were more likely to punish the accusers. In Cuenca, a priest who'd whipped his congregation into a frenzy over cursed milk was himself tried for false testimony after investigators found the cows had simply eaten bad hay. This pushback didn't stem from enlightenment, it was bureaucratic self-preservation. Witch trials created unpredictable mobs, diverted resources, and worst of all, shifted focus away from the crown's preferred targets. Yet the few Spanish witch trials that did occur reveal hidden fault lines. In the Basque Country, where the Inquisition held less sway, over 40 executions took place. many targeting women who'd inherited property or midwives whose knowledge challenged local physicians. And in Catalonia, several witches turned out to be Moriscos accused not of magic, but of preserving herbal remedies from their ancestral traditions. Even skepticism had limits when it intersected with racism or threatened male authority. The ultimate irony, Spain's relative restraint made its Inquisition more terrifying, not less. While Europe's witch hunts eventually collapsed under their own absurdity, Spain's tribunals endured for centuries precisely because they avoided distractions and stayed ruthlessly on mission. The lesson wasn't about justice, it was about efficiency. Why waste time on peasant delusions when real power and real profit lay elsewhere? In the end, the Spanish Inquisition didn't reject witch trials out of mercy. They rejected them because witches simply weren't worth the firewood. The Spanish Inquisition didn't collapse in a single dramatic moment. It withered, like a parasite starved of its host. By the early 18th century, Europe had entered the Age of Enlightenment, and Spain's once feared tribunal found itself on the wrong side of history. But the real death knell wasn't just new ideas, it was the rise of secular courts, which gradually stripped the Inquisition of its teeth. Take the case of Pablo de Olavide, a reformist official put on trial in 1776 for impiety. The charges: hosting French-style salons and reading Voltaire. But this time, something unexpected happened. Instead of cowering, Olavide's allies in the royal bureaucracy counterattacked, exposing how the tribunal's evidence consisted of hearsay and forged documents. For the first time, the public saw the machinery of fear for what it was, not divine justice but a political tool rusted beyond repair. The shift had been decades in the making. As Spain's empire faltered, the crown began prioritizing efficiency over orthodoxy. When the Inquisition tried to prosecute a group of Basque merchants for smuggling in 1732, the case was abruptly transferred to a secular court because the state couldn't afford delays that might disrupt tax revenues. Similarly, accusations of blasphemy against playwrights and artists were increasingly dismissed by Madrid, not out of tolerance, but because cultural prestige now mattered more than doctrinal purity. The tribunal's once absolute authority crumbled not through rebellion but irrelevance. Even the church grew wary of its own creation. By the mid-18th century, bishops openly clashed with inquisitors over jurisdiction, while Rome quietly encouraged Spanish clergy to bypass the tribunal altogether. The final humiliation came in 1813, when Napoleon's invading forces abolished the Inquisition, not as liberation but as bureaucratic housecleaning. And when Spain's Bourbon monarchy was restored, they chose not to revive it in full. Why? The answer lies in a memo from King Ferdinand VII's advisors. The Holy Office no longer serves the purposes for which it was established. Translation: it couldn't deliver money or control like it once had. The institution's death throes were as telling as its prime. In 1820, a liberal government formally disbanded it, auctioning off its archives for scrap paper. But the real end had come years earlier, when a Seville inquisitor complained in a letter that his jail was empty, his torturers idle, and his budget slashed. He wasn't mourning lost souls, he was lamenting lost influence. The Inquisition didn't fade because Spain stopped fearing heresy. It faded because the powerful found newer, subtler ways to rule. And in that quiet exit, we see the truth laid bare. This was never about saving souls. It was always about who held the whip. For centuries, the Inquisition's archives painted conversos as shadowy figures whispering Hebrew prayers behind closed doors, a narrative that justified endless persecution. But modern science has turned the tables, using DNA analysis to uncover a far more complex truth. Recent studies of Spanish and Latin American populations reveal genetic markers tracing back to Sephardic Jewish ancestry in nearly 20% of those tested, even in families with no oral tradition of Jewish roots. In places like New Mexico and Colombia, descendants of Conversos are discovering fragments of Passover rituals preserved as folk customs, like sweeping corners of the house during spring cleaning, a distorted echo of removing chamets. These weren't crypto-Jews plotting heresy. They were families clinging to subconscious remnants of identities torn from them generations earlier. The irony. The Inquisition's own obsession with documentation backfired spectacularly. Trial records from Toledo show defendants describing rituals they clearly didn't understand, women lighting Friday night candles without knowing why, or families avoiding pork while attributing it to grandmother's old sickness. What prosecutors saw as proof of hidden Judaism were actually cultural fossils, preserved by trauma long after their original meaning faded. In Belmonte, Portugal, just across the Spanish border, a community of Conversos survived in total secrecy for 500 years, marrying only among themselves and practicing a simplified Judaism reconstructed from half-remembered snippets. When anthropologists found them in the 1920s, their worship included Christian prayers alongside whispered Hebrew phrases they couldn't translate. Yet the tribunals needed these communities to exist perpetually. Like a self-replenishing resource, the specter of Judaizing justified the Inquisition's budget and staffing for centuries. A memo from 1632 reveals inquisitors in Seville complaining that declining accusations threatened their funding, prompting a sudden surge in arrests of elderly conversos on flimsy evidence. The charge teaching their grandchildren suspicious lullabies which turned out to be medieval Spanish folk songs with no Jewish connection. The system wasn't hunting heresy, it was manufacturing it, relying on circular logic where any behavior could be evidence. A Cuenca merchant's fastidious bookkeeping became secret Talmudic study, while a widow's habit of changing linens on Fridays was Sabbath preparation. The cruelest twist emerged in Mexico, where the Inquisition pursued Converso refugees with particular zeal. Trial transcripts from 1590 show indigenous witnesses baffled by accusations against their Spanish neighbors, like the case of a woman accused because she bathed often, a normal practice in pre-Columbian cultures but suspiciously Jewish to inquisitors. The tribunals weren't defending Christian purity. They were projecting their own obsessions onto people who'd moved on. Today, as genetic testing reconnects descendants with lost heritage, the full tragedy comes into focus. The Inquisition didn't just erase lives, it severed memory itself, leaving fragments buried like seeds that took centuries to resprout. In a Madrid archive, a 17th century inquisitor's note gloats about eradicating Judaism from a particular bloodline. But walk through that family's modern hometown, and you'll find young people studying Hebrew, reclaiming what was never truly lost, just waiting beneath layers of fear and time for its chance to breathe again. The Inquisition's reach didn't stop at Spain's borders. It slithered across Portugal in a web of shared terror and political convenience. When Spain expelled its Jewish population in 1492, nearly 100,000 refugees fled to neighboring Portugal, seeking safety under King Manuel I. But safety was an illusion. In a brutal twist of fate, Manuel forcibly converted them just 5 years later, creating a new class of targets for the Iberian Inquisitions, the New Christians, who now found themselves trapped between two ruthless systems. What followed wasn't just persecution, it was a cross-border partnership, where Spanish and Portuguese tribunals exchanged prisoners, evidence, and even executioners, all under the guise of holy unity. The collaboration was rooted in cold pragmatism. Portugal's Inquisition, formally established in 1536, modeled itself on Spain's playbook but with a sharper focus on economics. Lisbon's tribunals quickly realized that New Christians controlled vital trade networks stretching from Brazil to India. By sharing intelligence with Spanish inquisitors, they could track wealthy merchants who moved between kingdoms, confiscating assets with surgical precision. Take the case of Duarte Nunes, a Lisbon spice trader accused by Spanish agents of smuggling Judaic texts into Seville. Before he could protest, Portuguese officials arrested him, tried him in absentia, and split his confiscated cargo of pepper and gold with Madrid. The charge of heresy was just paperwork. The real crime was bypassing royal customs. This extradition system operated with chilling efficiency. In 1580, a Valencia tribunal demanded the arrest of a new Christian banker named Ferdinand Menz, who'd fled to Porto after Spanish inquisitors froze his accounts. Within weeks, Portuguese authorities shipped him back in chains, not because they cared about his faith, but because Madrid promised them a cut of his forfeited estates. The archives revealed dozens of such exchanges where prisoners became bargaining chips in a transcontinental shakedown. Even family ties offered no protection. When the Spanish merchant Gonzalo Vaz was denounced by a business rival in Toledo, his sister in Evora was arrested simultaneously on identical charges, ensuring neither kingdom could harbor the other's fugitives. The darkest collaborations happened in the colonies. In Brazil, where Portugal's Inquisition had limited manpower, Spanish familiars, lay agents of the tribunal operated freely, denouncing rivals in the sugar trade. A 1620 letter from Bahia describes Spanish Franciscans tipping off Portuguese officials about a hidden synagogue in Recife, leading to mass arrests. The payoff: the Franciscans gained control of the prisoners' sugar mills. Meanwhile, in Goa, Portuguese inquisitors extradited Spanish sailors accused of Protestantism, not to purify the faith, but to weaken Dutch competition in the spice trade. Heresy charges became the perfect smokescreen for economic warfare, yet the alliance had cracks. Portugal's nobility resented Spanish interference, especially after Madrid annexed their crown in 1580. In Braganza, aristocrats secretly shielded new Christian tax collectors from extradition, recognizing their financial value. And in 1745, Lisbon's inquisitors outright refused to hand over a group of merchants wanted by Spain, sparking a diplomatic spat. The reason: the accused had just funded a new royal opera house. Even in the Inquisition's shadow, money talked louder than dogma. What unraveled this partnership wasn't conscience but geopolitics. When Portugal regained independence in 1640, the tribunals grew wary of sharing power. A memo from Lisbon's chief inquisitor warned that Spanish agents were overreaching by arresting Portuguese subjects in the Americas. By the 18th century, the system devolved into competitive snooping, with each kingdom's inquisitors spying on the other's colonial officials for leverage. The Holy War against heresy had become a holy mess of mutual distrust, proof that when terror crosses borders, even the oppressors start looking over their shoulders. The archives tell one final, ironic tale. In 1780, a Spanish inquisitor fleeing bankruptcy slipped into Portugal, hoping his counterparts would protect him. Instead, they arrested him for suspicious travel. The charge: carrying unsigned letters, the same tactic he'd used to ruin countless lives. The system he helped build had finally come full circle, devouring its own. Consider the fate of Antonio Perez, once the most powerful secretary to King Philip II until he dared to oppose the monarch's policies. In 1579, after leaking state secrets about Spain's disastrous campaign in the Netherlands, Perez found himself charged not with treason but with heresy. The twist: his accusers claimed he'd kept a Jewish amulet for protection, a charge so flimsy even the tribunal's own prosecutors privately dismissed it. What followed wasn't a trial, it was a masterclass in political theater. Perez was tortured until he implicated half the Aragonese nobility, turning his case into a pretext for dismantling regional resistance to royal authority. When he finally escaped to France, his published memoirs exposed the truth. The Inquisition's chains were just Philip's favorite tool for silencing dissent. Then there was the chilling case of the Count of Villamediana, a 17th-century poet whose satires skewered the corruption of King Philip IV's court. His real mistake, allegedly whispering that the Queen's newborn heir wasn't the king's, Within days, Villa Mediana was accused of hosting blasphemous literary salons where guests supposedly mocked church doctrine. No evidence was presented beyond the testimony of two actors, both indebted to the crown. The tribunal demanded his execution, but Philip, ever the strategist, commuted it to house arrest. The message was clear: cross the monarchy and even nobility won't save you. Villa Mediana lasted 3 months before mysteriously perishing in a fire, his library of subversive manuscripts reduced to ashes. Perhaps no case reveals the Inquisition's political machinery more starkly than that of Archbishop Bartolomé de Carranza. As Spain's primate and a renowned theologian, Carranza seemed untouchable until he advocated for reforms that threatened both royal and papal authority. His 1558 arrest shocked Europe. For 17 years, the tribunal kept him imprisoned while investigating his supposedly heretical writings, which included daring ideas like "the poor deserve compassion." The real offense, his influence over Emperor Charles V, whom he'd urged to curb the Inquisition's power. Rome eventually acquitted him, but only after his health was broken and his reputation smeared. The lesson wasn't lost on Spain's clergy. Challenge the system, and even a prince of the church could vanish into a cell. Even foreign diplomats weren't immune. In 1612, the Venetian ambassador Antonio Foscarini was accused of espionage after criticizing Spain's military failures. Lacking jurisdiction over envoys, the Inquisition simply declared he'd been seen reading suspicious Italian texts during Mass, a charge that allowed them to raid his residence. They found nothing incriminating but still had him expelled, proving the tribunal could bend international law when it served Madrid's interests. These weren't rogue prosecutions, they were calculated strikes. The archives reveal meticulous coordination between the Suprema and royal advisors, with coded notes like "the matter of the Duke requires ecclesiastical handling" peppering correspondence. By the 18th century, the pattern was so blatant that reformist statesman Gaspar Melchor de Jovellanos wrote, "They call it God's justice, but the dockets smell of ink and politics." The Inquisition's greatest heresy may have been its hypocrisy. A system built to purify faith became the monarchy's sharpest instrument for silencing truth. And in that corruption, we see the rot at the heart of empire, where fear wears a crucifix and dissent is the only unpardonable sin. The key to the Inquisition's power wasn't just the rack or the stake, it was an army of unseen eyes and whispered secrets. Every town, every parish, every marketplace had them. The familiars, lay informants sworn to report even the faintest whiff of heresy. These weren't shadowy spies lurking in alleyways, they were neighbors, shopkeepers, even family members. A baker in Toledo might denounce a rival for muttering strange prayers while kneading dough. A servant in Seville could earn a reward for noting her master's refusal to eat pork. The system turned daily life into a minefield where any slip, a missed mass, an offhand joke about saints could land in a tribunal's ledger. What made this network so effective was its bureaucracy. Each denunciation triggered a meticulous paper trail. Witness statements were cross-checked against prior accusations, creating dossiers that grew thicker with each generation. In Granada, archives reveal a single family monitored for over a century because a great-grandfather once owned a book with suspicious marginalia, the real genius. The Inquisition rarely had to hunt for heresy, it let society do the work. A Valladolid weaver might accuse his competitor, only to find himself investigated months later when the man's cousin retaliated. Fear became self-replicating, with each accusation breeding fresh paranoia. The wealthiest targets faced especially creative surveillance. Bankers and merchants often hosted spiritual advisors, priests assigned to guide them who doubled as informants. One 1613 case from Barcelona shows a confessor reporting a merchant's wife for excessive grief after her child's death, interpreting it as doubt in God's will. Even private homes weren't safe. Inquisitors paid servants to note dinner conversations, while laundresses checked undergarments for ritual fringes. The archives brim with trivialities: a Valencia noble's preference for bathing on Fridays, a widow's habit of turning mirrors to the wall, all recast as evidence. But the darkest innovation was the Edict of Grace, a monthly public reading that offered pardons to those who confessed heresy voluntarily. It sounded merciful, but the subtext was vicious. The edicts listed obscure sins no one had considered, like avoiding pork out of habit, rather than faith tricking the guilt-ridden into self-incrimination. In Murcia, a farmer came forward to admit he'd once washed his hands before prayer, like his grandfather taught him. That confession implicated his entire village, triggering 19 arrests. The tribunals didn't just react to heresy, they planted its seeds, then harvested the fallout. The system's reach extended beyond Spain's borders. In Rome, Venetian ambassadors wrote home about Spanish agents bribing Italian servants to report on exiled conversos. In Antwerp, traders knew to avoid deals with anyone who asked too many questions. Inquisition informants often posed as merchants. Even the colonies weren't spared. A 1680 letter from Mexico City describes a nun secretly documenting which confessants took communion too frequently, suspecting them of Protestant enthusiasm. Yet the greatest damage wasn't in the arrests, it was in the silence left behind. Families stopped sharing stories, fearing children might repeat them. Recipes were rewritten to remove suspicious spices like cumin or saffron. Playwrights inserted pro-Inquisition lines into comedies to prove loyalty. The archives themselves reveal the paradox: thousands of pages documenting everyday speech, yet the real crime was often just talking at all. By the 18th century, the system had grown so bloated that tribunals struggled under the weight of their own paperwork, a fitting end for an empire that valued control over truth and surveillance over trust. The Inquisition didn't just wield power, it built it brick by brick, fresco by fresco, crafting an architecture of fear that loomed over Spain's skyline. Walk through any major city during its reign, and you'd immediately know who ruled. Tribunal palaces dominated central plazas, their facades carved with ominous symbols, flaming crosses, scales of justice, the occasional grimacing demon. These weren't just offices, they were stage sets designed to humble anyone who approached. Take the Casa de la Inquisición in Barcelona, where the entrance archway featured a relief of Saint Michael trampling a writhing heretic. The message wasn't subtle. This was where angels and devils fought, and the inquisitors held the gavel of God. Inside, the theatrics continued. Interrogation chambers were often placed directly behind chapel altars, so prisoners could hear Mass through the walls while awaiting torture, a cruel reminder that salvation and suffering shared the same address. In Valladolid, the tribunal's meeting hall boasted a ceiling fresco of the Last Judgment, with painted flames licking at the damned, positioned so accused heretics would see it as they knelt before their judges. Even the furniture whispered threats. Defendant chairs were carved deliberately lower than the inquisitors, forcing physical submission, while iron rings bolted to the floor marked where the condemned would stand during sentencing. Every architectural choice, from the thickness of dungeon walls to the placement of confessionals, reinforced one idea: resistance was as futile as shouting into a vault. Art played an equally calculated role. The Inquisition commissioned painters like Francisco de Zurbarán to produce works depicting serene, almost bureaucratic scenes of tribunal life, ink-stained clerks recording confessions, black-robed inquisitors debating theology by candlelight. These weren't portraits of fanatics, but of civil servants doing holy paperwork, sanitizing violence with a veneer of order. Contrast this with the gruesome public altarpieces showing saints like Peter of Verona being martyred by shadowy heretics, their wounds oozing gold leaf. Displayed in churches, these images justified preemptive brutality by framing inquisitors as protectors under siege. The genius of this propaganda lay in its duality. For the literate elite, intricate engravings in legal manuals depicted trials as meticulously balanced scales. For the masses, processional floats during religious festivals featured actors reenacting auto-da-fe with papier-mâché flames. Even children were indoctrinated through board games like The Path to Heaven, where landing on a space marked heresy sent players back to the start. The Inquisition didn't just punish dissent, it aestheticized compliance, turning obedience into a cultural reflex. Perhaps nowhere was this more insidious than in the transformation of urban space itself. After major auto-da-fe, the sites of executions often became permanent installations. Madrid's Plaza Mayor, today a bustling tourist attraction, once featured a stone platform called the Quemadero, the burning place where ashes were left visible for days as a warning. In Seville, the street leading to the tribunal's door was deliberately kept narrow, forcing crowds to slow as they passed, ensuring they'd absorb every posted edict. Meanwhile, the homes of the condemned were sometimes left standing but marked with carved symbols, turning architecture into a scarlet letter that stigmatized generations. The legacy of this visual regime lingers. Modern restorations of Inquisition buildings often downplay their original purpose, repurposing them as museums or government offices. But look closely at the walls, the scratch marks in dungeon stones, the faint outlines of murals painted over during the Enlightenment, and the whispers return. This was never just about religion. It was about constructing a world where power wasn't just exercised, but omnipresent, inescapable, etched into the very stones people walked on. The tribunals understood something timeless. Control isn't just about force. It's about who designs the stage and who gets to write the script. The term Black Legend didn't originate in Spain. It was forged in the printing presses of England and the Netherlands, where pamphlets and woodcuts depicted the Inquisition as a uniquely Spanish horror. Lurid illustrations showed hooded torturers drowning babies in boiling oil, while Protestant preachers thundered about Catholic brutality. But this propaganda campaign, designed to paint Spain as Europe's villain, had an unintended consequence. By focusing solely on sensationalized violence, it obscured the Inquisition's far more insidious machinery of control. The real story wasn't just about bloodshed, it was about how an institution perfected the art of power under the guise of piety. Consider the infamous Spanish Inquisition, mythos spread by Dutch engravers like Theodore de Bry. His prints, widely circulated in the late 1600s, showed racks and iron maidens in exaggerated detail. Yet these images ignored the tribunal's bureaucratic brilliance, the way they used legalistic theater, not just torture, to paralyze dissent. A single auto-da-fe might burn 3 heretics, but its real impact came from the thousands who watched, then hurried home to censor their own books and conversations. Protestant Europe fixated on the flames, missing the chilling efficiency of the paperwork behind them. The distortion wasn't accidental. When English privateer Francis Drake raided Spanish ports, his crews brought back tales of dungeons filled with Protestant martyrs' stories that galvanized anti-Spanish sentiment. Yet archives reveal most foreign prisoners were actually spies or smugglers, charged with heresy as a legal pretext, the Spanish Inquisition's actual obsession. Not English sailors, but converso financiers who might fund their enemies. By amplifying gore over greed, Protestant propagandists turned Spain into a monstrous caricature, letting the real architects of repression, the crown lawyers, the tax officials, the silent partners in confiscated wealth, fade into the shadows. Even Spanish critics fell into the trap. Enlightenment thinkers like Jovellanos condemned the Inquisition's cruelties, but their outrage mirrored Protestant tropes, missing the system's economic underpinnings. When the tribunal finally dissolved in 1834, liberals celebrated the end of torture, not realizing they'd inherited its financial playbook, where state seizures and loyalty tests simply wore new masks. The Black Legend succeeded too well. By making Spain's sins seem medieval, it let modern abuses hide in plain sight. Today, historians sifting through trial records find a paradox. The Inquisition's violence was real, but often less spectacular than its reputation. What truly terrified contemporaries wasn't the stake. It was the warrant slipped into a pocket during Mass, the neighbor who stopped speaking, the property ledgers vanishing into tribunal vaults. The Black Legend's greatest crime wasn't exaggeration. It was simplification, reducing a sophisticated empire of fear into a crude horror show. And in that reduction, it let the real lesson go unlearned. That power thrives not when it screams, but when it whispers. History never truly repeats itself, but it echoes, sometimes with chilling precision. The Spanish Inquisition's machinery of control, disguised as divine mandate, finds unsettling reflections in modern systems where ideology becomes a smokescreen for power. Consider how today's surveillance states deploy technology instead of torturers, tracking dissent through algorithms that would make even the most meticulous inquisitorial scribe blush. China's social credit system, for instance, doesn't burn heretics, it blacklists them, stripping access to loans, travel, even education based on opaque scores. Like the Inquisition's familiars, ordinary citizens are incentivized to report untrustworthy neighbors, creating a self-policing society where the threat isn't flames but isolation. The parallels deepen when examining how persecution is bureaucratized. In some nations, religious or ethnic minorities face anti-extremism, laws that, much like the limpieza de sangre statutes, criminalize cultural identity under the guise of security. Uyghurs in Xinjiang aren't accused of crypto-Islam, they're labeled separatists, their traditions pathologized as threats to national unity. Just as the Moriscos' irrigation systems were confiscated as evidence of heresy, modern states seize assets under counterterrorism pretexts, turning livelihoods into leverage. The tools have evolved from parchment ledgers to biometric databases, but the goal remains unchanged: silence through systemic erasure. Even the Inquisition's propaganda playbook survives in digital form. State-sponsored media outlets today frame dissidents as moral contagions, much like auto-da-fe pamphlets depicted heretics corrupting the faithful. Russia's portrayal of Ukrainian activists as Nazis or Venezuela's branding of protesters as economic saboteurs mirrors the tribunal's tactic of recasting resistance as existential sin. The genius lies in the inversion: oppression becomes protection, and critics are transformed into threats to the very society they seek to improve. Yet the most insidious parallel is the weaponization of everyday interactions. Like the edicts of grace that turned self-confession into a trap, modern loyalty oaths and voluntary surveillance apps create cultures of complicity. In North Korea, families are punished for failing to report relatives' disloyalty, echoing the Inquisition's destruction of trust within converso communities. Even corporate workplaces now emulate the tribunal's methods, with HR departments encouraging employees to monitor colleagues for problematic speech, a secularized version of denunciation, where career consequences replace the stake. The lesson isn't that history is cyclical, but that power adapts. The Inquisition's legacy isn't just a medieval nightmare, it's a blueprint for how authority dresses itself in virtue, turning fear into a renewable resource. When we recognize its patterns in today's world, we're not seeing ghosts. We're reading the fine print of control, written in a language as old as empire itself. For centuries, the story of the Spanish Inquisition was written by its own archivists, carefully curated narratives of righteous purges against heresy. But modern historians armed with digitized records are uncovering a far messier truth, one where faith was often the thinnest veneer over raw economic and political calculation. Take the groundbreaking work of scholars like Dr. Maria José del Rio, who spent 5 years analyzing over 20,000 trial records from Seville's tribunal. Her team's algorithms detected startling patterns: spikes in prosecutions consistently aligned with royal debt crises, while heresy accusations disproportionately targeted merchants holding lucrative contracts for military supplies. One telling case from 1584 shows a silk exporter named Alonso Méndez arrested just days after refusing to sell his cargo to the crown at below market rates. His charge, secretly observing Yom Kippur, a claim based solely on a competitor's testimony that Méndez had once skipped a business lunch. What makes this new research so damning is the sheer volume of corroborating data. In Valencia, historians cross-referenced property confiscation records with tax rolls, discovering that 93% of major forfeitures involved families who'd recently acquired lands through royal land grants. The tribunals weren't randomly hunting heretics, they were surgically reclaiming assets from beneficiaries who'd outlived their political usefulness. Even the timing of auto da fe followed cynical logic. A study of Madrid's public burnings between 1600 and 1650 reveals 80% occurred within 2 months of popular unrest or noble revolts, effectively using terror as crowd control. The digitized archives also expose how the Inquisition manipulated its own paperwork. In Toledo, scholars found multiple cases where trial transcripts had been altered post-conviction, with phrases like known moneylender inserted beside defendants' names to retroactively justify seizures. More chilling are the marginal notes now visible in high-resolution scans, inquisitors doodling profit calculations beside torture confessions or circling items in prisoners' asset lists like shoppers browsing a catalog. One particularly brazen example from Cuenca shows a tribunal treasurer's memo estimating a convicted merchant's estate would cover 3 months' salaries for all officials. Perhaps the most revelatory findings come from network analysis. By mapping relationships between accusers and beneficiaries, researchers at the University of Barcelona proved nearly 40% of 16th century denunciations traced back to business rivals or inheritance claimants. The infamous case of the Carvajal family in Mexico City, where 11 relatives were burned for Judaizing in 1596, now reads differently when archives reveal their silver mines were swiftly auctioned to the viceroy's brother-in-law. Even the Inquisition's geographical spread tells a story. Tribunals clustered near trade hubs and mining regions, while remote areas with little wealth saw barely any activity. These digital tools are also rewriting individual stories. Optical character recognition has deciphered thousands of previously illegible prisoner petitions, like that of Isabel Rodriguez, a midwife who spent 12 years protesting her 1602 conviction. Her newly uncovered letters prove she was actually jailed after refusing to share herbal remedy patents with an inquisitor's apothecary cousin. The same technology revealed rampant forgery in genealogical investigations, pages torn from family Bibles, baptismal records with altered dates, all to manufacture heresy where none existed. The ultimate irony, the very bureaucracy designed to obscure the Inquisition's motives has become its undoing. Those meticulously notarized ledgers, those endless property inventories, they've allowed 21st century historians to follow the money with forensic precision. What emerges isn't a clash of religions, but a predatory financial system disguised as divine justice. The burnings may have stopped centuries ago, but the truth they tried to bury is finally rising from the ashes, one digitized parchment at a time. Even after combing through stacks of trial records and confiscation ledgers, historians still grapple with unsettling gaps, deliberate erasures that hint at secrets the Inquisition never wanted exposed. Take the infamous lost year of 1587 in Seville, where an entire tribunal ledger disappears mid-sentence, resuming months later with no mention of 17 high-profile cases. Were these pages ripped out to protect powerful names? A single surviving scrap found pressed between 2 floorboards in 1982 suggests so. It lists a duke's nephew as tainted by Jewish ancestry, a claim never pursued in any known trial. The missing cases may have been casualties of political blackmail, not piety. Then there's the enigma of inquisitorial skeptics, those within the system who quietly questioned its methods. In 1612, a letter from Toledo's chief inquisitor to Madrid cryptically complains about a colleague who argues over proofs like a dialectician and doubts the devil's marks. The rebel, a little-known lawyer named Gaspar de Quintana, whose personal diary discovered in a Mexican monastery in 2011 reveals shocking entries. If heresy is so omnipresent, why must we invent it? And Torquemada's ghost laughs at us from hell. How many others harbored doubts we'll likely never know. The tribunal routinely purged its own ranks, and Quintana's fate is conspicuously absent from the archives. The greatest mystery lurks in the colonial records. In Lima's tribunal vault, a 1644 inventory lists a chest of pernicious volumes seized from a Portuguese merchant, but the contents were reportedly burned unexamined. Yet 3 centuries later, a Chilean historian found a smuggled copy of the cargo manifest in a Jesuit archive, noting the books included astronomical treatises by Copernicus and Kepler. Were these labeled heretical to suppress scientific dissent, or was this a confiscation masquerading as censorship, with the burned books quietly funneled to elite collectors? The chest's silver lock was later traced to a viceroy's private chapel, raising more questions than answers. Most tantalizing are the whispers of internal resistance. In Aragon, a 1996 restoration of an old convent revealed hidden graffiti beneath the plaster, crude sketches of an inquisitor wearing donkey ears, accompanied by verses mocking his obsession with Moorish spices and widows' purses. The artist, likely a scribe or jailer, someone with enough access to witness corruption firsthand. These clandestine critiques suggest fractures in the monolith, proof that even within its halls some recognize the hypocrisy. Perhaps the most haunting question isn't about what was destroyed, but what was never recorded. The Vatican's recently opened Inquisition archives contain a curious memo from 1692, where a Spanish cardinal warns Rome that certain tribunals keep double books, one for official scrutiny, another detailing special arrangements with local elites. If these shadow ledgers existed, their contents died with the men who burned them. Yet their ghostly absence speaks volumes, a silent testament to the rot festering beneath the gilded cross. The Inquisition didn't just hide its crimes, it buried its conscience, leaving us to dig through the ashes for truths it fought desperately to erase. What made the Spanish Inquisition so dangerously effective wasn't just its brutality, it was its adaptability. A weapon disguised as a sacrament, it morphed to serve every need of those in power. A financial engine when the crown's coffers ran dry, a political cudgel against rivals, a cultural eraser for inconvenient identities. But perhaps its most insidious legacy was how seamlessly it fused ideology with bureaucracy, turning terror into paperwork and bigotry into policy. Those meticulous trial records, those itemized confiscations, they didn't just document repression. They normalized it, embedding violence in the dry ink of administrative routine. Consider the paradox: an institution that claimed to purify faith actually corrupted it, using divine language to justify earthly greed. When a merchant's ledgers became evidence of heresy or a midwife's herbal knowledge proof of witchcraft, the sacred became a hollow shell, a mask for raw ambition. This wasn't medieval barbarism, it was something far more modern, a precursor to the 20th century regimes that would similarly weaponize ideology, where concentration camps had filing cabinets and purges were logged in triplicate. The Inquisition's real innovation wasn't the rack, it was the receipt, yet the greatest lesson lies in its afterlife. Long after the last auto da fe, the mechanisms it perfected lived on: the demonization of minorities as existential threats, the blurring of law and vengeance, the way fear could be monetized. You'll find its fingerprints in the red baiting of the McCarthy era, in the dystopian social credit systems of today, even in the algorithmic policing that labels entire communities as pre-criminal. Power never abandons a good playbook, it just updates the vocabulary. So the next time you encounter an institution claiming moral certainty, whether a government, a corporation, or even a social movement, ask the questions the Inquisition's victims never could: who benefits from this righteousness? What goes unchallenged under the cover of crusade? History's darkest chapters aren't just about the monsters we remember. They're about the ordinary systems that made monstrosity mundane. And that's why the Inquisition still matters, not as a medieval relic, but as a mirror. The robes and hoods are gone, the human capacity to confuse control for justice. That's time.